In the gleaming halls of Boston's Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Victoria Reynolds was about to learn that some wounds can't be healed with medicine alone. Her perfectly organized world of surgical schedules and efficiency metrics was about to collide with a decorated Vietnam veteran whose quiet presence would change everything. But in that moment, rushing past a military funeral procession blocking her path to the operating room, she had no idea that the silver-haired man in dress uniform watching her was about to teach her the most important lesson of her career. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crisp autumn morning cast long shadows through the hospital's east wing windows as Dr. Victoria Reynolds strode purposefully through the corridors, her white coat flowing behind her like a banner of authority. The gentle tap of her Italian leather shoes against the polished floor created a rhythm she'd perfected over 15 years of building her reputation as Boston's most efficient thoracic surgeon. She glanced at her Apple Watch. 7:28 a.m. Perfect. 2 minutes ahead of schedule, just as she'd planned. Victoria had long ago mastered the art of temporal precision, treating every minute as a commodity more precious than gold. In her world, time wasn't just money. It was the difference between life and death. Dr. Reynolds, a young resident hurried to catch up with her, clutching a tablet and nearly dropping his coffee in the process. Victoria didn't slow her pace. "Walk and talk, Dr. Chen," she said, her eyes forward, already reviewing her mental checklist for the day's procedures. "You have exactly 45 seconds before I reach the surgical wing." The resident fell into step beside her, slightly out of breath. The Thompson procedure. His pre-op labs came back with slightly elevated. "Send them to my tablet," Victoria interrupted, navigating around a group of nurses with the practiced ease of someone who viewed other people as mere obstacles in a carefully plotted course. "I'll review them during my scheduled data analysis period at 10:15. Her day was divided into precise increments, surgeries timed down to the minute, consultations limited to exactly 15 minutes, rounds conducted with military precision. Victoria had built her reputation on this efficiency, transforming Mercy General's thoracic surgery department from a middling service into a well-oiled machine that was now ranked third in the nation. The hospital administrator had once joked that you could set your watch by Dr. Reynolds's schedule. Victoria hadn't found it amusing. Of course you could set your watch by her schedule. That was the point. Precision meant perfection, and perfection meant saved lives. She reached the surgical wing's main doors, automatically reaching for the hand sanitizer dispenser without breaking stride. Dr. Chen was still talking, something about the patient's anxiety levels and family concerns. Victoria resisted the urge to sigh. Young doctors were always too emotional, too caught up in the human element. They hadn't yet learned that efficiency was the highest form of caring. "Dr. Chen," she said, pausing briefly to fix him with her trademark steel-blue gaze, "do you know what my mortality rate is?" Lowest in the department, Doctor, 1.2%. "And do you know how I maintain that rate?" She didn't wait for his answer. "By treating surgery like what it is, a precision procedure where every second counts. Patient anxiety is the concern of the psych department. Family worries are for social workers. My job is to keep people alive through surgical excellence. Excellence requires efficiency. Efficiency requires focus." The words came automatically, a mantra she'd repeated to countless residents over the years. Victoria had learned early in her career that emotion was the enemy of precision. She'd built her success on this foundation, measuring her worth in saved lives and minimized minutes. Her watch buzzed. 7:30 a.m. Time for her first pre-op review. She turned away from Dr. Chen without another word, her mind already shifting to the procedure ahead. But as she reached for the door to the surgical suite, an unusual sound caught her attention. The muffled drums of a military band drifting in from the hospital's front entrance. Victoria felt a flash of irritation. The hospital's board of directors had approved some sort of military funeral procession to pass through the main entrance today, something about honoring a long-serving hospital volunteer who'd been a decorated veteran. She'd objected in the last staff meeting, pointing out the disruption to hospital operations, but had been outvoted. Sentiment over sense, she muttered under her breath, pushing through the doors. She had 3 major procedures scheduled today, and no amount of ceremonial disruption would throw off her timeline. Victoria Reynolds had built her life on controlling every variable, every minute, every outcome. No drumbeat or trumpet call would change that. She had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, her carefully controlled world would begin to unravel, all because of a silver-haired veteran in dress blues who was about to teach her that some things in life can't be measured in minutes or methodology. But for now, she walked on, confident in her efficiency, blind to the lesson awaiting her in the seemingly pointless ceremony she was so determined to ignore. The first sign that this day would be different came as Victoria approached the main surgical corridor. The usual sounds of hospital activity, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, the gentle beeping of medical equipment, the murmur of professional conversations, were being slowly overtaken by something else. The military band's music was growing louder, its somber rhythm seeming to pulse through the hospital's sterile halls like an unwelcome heartbeat. She rounded the corner and stopped abruptly. The corridor ahead, her carefully plotted route to operating room 3, was filled with people. Hospital staff, patients and visitors lined the walls, many in wheelchairs or with IV poles, all facing the large windows overlooking the hospital's main entrance. Victoria felt her jaw tighten as she surveyed the scene. This was exactly the kind of disruption she'd warned about in the staff meeting. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority that usually parted crowds like the Red Sea. A few people glanced her way, but no one moved. A nurse she recognized from the cardiac unit actually raised a finger to her lips, gesturing for silence. Victoria felt her face flush with indignation. Didn't they understand what was at stake here? Every minute spent gawking at some ceremony was a minute wasted. A minute that could cost lives. She checked her watch again. 7:34 a.m. Her carefully planned schedule was starting to slip, each passing second, feeling like sand through an hourglass. The Thompson procedure was scheduled for 8 a.m. sharp, and she still needed to complete her pre-op review and surgical prep routine that she'd perfected over thousands of operations. "I have a surgery scheduled," she announced, louder this time, pulling her ID badge from her coat pocket like a shield. "I need to get through." Still, the crowd remained frustratingly immobile, their attention fixed on the scene outside. Victoria moved closer to the windows, determined to push through, but found herself involuntarily glancing out at whatever had captured everyone's attention. A military honor guard was assembling at the hospital's main entrance, their dress uniforms pristine in the morning light. 6 members in perfectly pressed blues stood at attention, while others prepared what appeared to be a flag-draped memorial display. An older man in a decorated uniform was speaking quietly with hospital administrators, his bearing so straight and dignified that he seemed to make everyone around him stand taller. Victoria recognized him vaguely, Dr. James Harrison, the hospital's former chief of surgery, now retired. She'd heard stories about his military service before becoming a surgeon, but had always considered them irrelevant to the practice of modern medicine. Medicine was about progress, about efficiency, about measurable outcomes, not about old war stories and outdated traditions. "Dr. Reynolds," a voice called softly. She turned to see Sarah Martinez, one of the senior nurses, looking at her with an expression that mixed respect with something else. Disappointment, perhaps. "The ceremony won't take long," They're honoring Joe Martinez today. Victoria searched her mental database of hospital personnel. The volunteer from the children's ward? Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening slightly. 22 years he volunteered here, after serving 30 years in the Marines. 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars. He spent every Tuesday and Thursday reading to the kids in oncology, never missed a day, unless he was having his own chemo treatments. He was my uncle. The information registered in Victoria's mind like data points on a chart, but she pushed away the attempt at emotional manipulation. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, the words coming out with practiced automation. "But I have patients depending on me. Lives are at stake here. We can't stop the hospital from functioning for a memorial service." She moved to push past the nurse, but Sarah's next words made her pause. "You know what Uncle Joe used to say about the kids in oncology? He said they were the bravest soldiers he'd ever met, braver than him, braver than his Marine buddies. He said they taught him more about courage than all his years in combat." Victoria felt something twist uncomfortably in her chest, but she pushed the sensation away. She'd learned long ago that stories like this, emotional appeals meant to spark sympathy, were obstacles to efficient medical care. Statistics, procedures, protocols. These were the tools that saved lives, not sentimental memories of a deceased volunteer. The band's music swelled suddenly, and a ripple of movement went through the crowd. Through the windows, Victoria could see more veterans arriving, many in wheelchairs pushed by family members or hospital staff, others walking slowly but proudly in their military caps and pins. They were gathering near the memorial display, creating an impromptu honor guard of their own. 2 minutes, Victoria announced to no one in particular, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "I'll wait 2 minutes, but then I need this corridor cleared. Medicine doesn't wait for ceremony." She checked her watch again. 7:37 a.m. The schedule was now officially disrupted, and she'd need to adjust every subsequent appointment and procedure to accommodate this delay. The very thought made her skin crawl. But as she stood there, impatiently counting the seconds, she became aware of a presence behind her. Something about it made the hair on the back of her neck stand up, an aura of authority that seemed to fill the space without a word being spoken. Victoria turned slightly, already preparing a defense of her position, and found herself looking into the weathered face of a man who would soon shatter every certainty she'd built her career upon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The man standing behind Victoria was tall and straight-backed, his military bearing evident despite his advanced age. His dress uniform bore witness to decades of service, each medal and ribbon telling a story of sacrifice and duty that Victoria, in her rush to maintain her schedule, couldn't begin to comprehend. But it wasn't his decorations that commanded attention. It was his eyes, clear and steady, carrying a weight of experience that made Victoria's 15 years of surgical expertise suddenly feel insignificant. The morning sun, streaming through the windows, caught the medals on his chest, creating small prisms of light that danced across the hospital walls. Victoria found herself involuntarily cataloguing the decorations, her precise mind automatically creating order even in this moment of disruption. Silver star, bronze star, purple heart, the symbols of sacrifice lined up like the surgical instruments she relied upon, each one serving a specific purpose, each one telling part of a larger story. "Corporal Joseph Martinez," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the corridor turn to listen, was more than just a hospital volunteer. He wasn't speaking directly to Victoria, but she felt the weight of each word nonetheless. He was a Marine who survived the Battle of Khe Sanh, only to face an even longer battle with cancer. He never surrendered to either enemy. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, her hand unconsciously moving to her watch. 7:42 a.m. The Thompson procedure was now seriously threatened, and she could feel her carefully structured schedule crumbling with each passing minute. She opened her mouth to speak, to assert the primacy of medical necessity over ceremonial respect, but something in the old veteran's bearing made the words die in her throat. The honor guard outside had begun their ceremony in earnest now. The sharp commands carried through the windows, each word precise and measured, creating a rhythm as exact as any surgical procedure. Victoria found herself noting the efficiency of their movements, the economy of motion, the perfect synchronization. This, at least, was something she could appreciate, though she'd never admit it. 8 steps, the veteran behind her said, as if reading her thoughts. That's how many steps the honor guard takes for each movement. Each step precisely measured, each motion practiced thousands of times. They'll perform this ceremony in rain or snow, in heat or cold, because respect doesn't wait for convenient weather. He paused, his eyes meeting Victoria's with uncomfortable directness, just as perhaps some things shouldn't wait for convenient schedules. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks, but years of operating under pressure had taught her to maintain composure in any situation. "With all due respect, sir," she said, her voice carefully modulated, "while your ceremony is undoubtedly important, I have patients who need immediate medical attention. Surely you understand that saving lives takes precedence over ceremonial obligations." A small smile crossed the veteran's weathered face, but it held no humor. "Saving lives, Doctor? Joe Martinez saved lives too. Not with a scalpel or surgical precision, but with something equally powerful, hope. Do you know how many children in the oncology ward held on for one more day because they wanted to hear the end of the story he was reading them? How many parents found the strength to continue treatment because of the courage he showed in his own battle?" The words hit Victoria with unexpected force. She'd seen the old volunteer in the children's ward countless times, of course, always with a book in his hands, and children gathered around him. She'd dismissed it as a pleasant but ultimately insignificant activity, something that had no measurable impact on medical outcomes. Now, looking at the growing crowd of veterans and hospital staff gathering for the ceremony, she began to wonder if there were some outcomes that couldn't be measured in her precise medical metrics. Through the windows, she watched as more veterans arrived. Some walked with canes or prosthetic limbs, others were pushed in wheelchairs, but all moved with a dignity that transcended their physical limitations. Many wore caps or pins indicating their service: Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, spanning generations of American conflicts. They were gathering to honor one of their own, creating a living memorial of shared sacrifice and understanding. The honor guard began the flag ceremony, their movements as precise as any surgical procedure Victoria had ever performed. Each fold had meaning, she realized, though she didn't know what those meanings were. The flag was being transformed through their careful movements, just as surely as her surgical procedures transformed lives. Different methods, different purposes, but perhaps, and this thought made her uncomfortable, equally valid in their own ways. Sarah Martinez, the nurse who had spoken earlier, stepped forward to stand beside the veteran. Victoria noticed for the first time how much the nurse's bearing echoed her uncle's military precision. "Uncle Joe used to say that there are many ways to save a life," Sarah said softly. "Sometimes it's with medicine and surgery. Sometimes it's with a story and a smile, and sometimes it's by showing respect for the things that give life meaning." Victoria checked her watch again. 7:47 a.m. The Thompson procedure was now irrevocably delayed. She should be feeling panic, should be rushing to rearrange her schedule, should be asserting her authority to clear the corridor. Instead, she found herself standing still, watching the ceremony unfold with growing awareness that she was witnessing something she had never fully understood before: the power of ritual to heal wounds, that no surgery could touch. The band began playing again, the mournful notes of taps floating through the morning air. Victoria saw tears in the eyes of the gathered veterans, each lost in memories of their own fallen comrades. The sound seemed to penetrate the hospital's sterile atmosphere, transforming the familiar corridor into something sacred. And for the first time in her precisely measured career, Dr. Victoria Reynolds felt something shift in her understanding of what it truly meant to heal. The veteran who had been standing behind Victoria stepped forward, positioning himself at the window beside her. In the growing morning light, she could now see him more clearly. His name tag read Colonel David Harrison, and something about that name tugged at her memory. She had heard it before, in conversations among the older hospital staff, usually spoken with a mixture of respect and awe. "You're wondering about the Thompson procedure?" he said, not looking at her, but keeping his eyes on the ceremony below. His voice carried the calm assurance of someone who had faced far greater challenges than a delayed surgery schedule. 8 o'clock, operating room 3, a complex thoracic procedure that you've scheduled down to the minute. Victoria felt a jolt of surprise. "How did you—" "I was chief of surgery here for 20 years before I returned to active duty after 9/11, he explained, still watching the ceremony. "Some things don't change. The rhythm of a hospital, the importance we place on our schedules, the belief that efficiency equals excellence." He turned to look at her then, his eyes carrying decades of experience both in surgery and in war. "But some things should change, Dr. Reynolds." The way he said her name made it clear he knew exactly who she was, knew her reputation for precision and efficiency, knew the stories that circulated about the Ice Queen of thoracic surgery. Victoria felt suddenly exposed, as if her carefully constructed professional facade was being seen through by eyes that had witnessed far more important battles than her daily fights against time and mortality rates. "Colonel Harrison," she began, trying to regain her footing in the conversation, "if you were chief of surgery, then you understand the importance of maintaining surgical schedules. Every minute of delay—" "Let me tell you about minutes, Doctor," he interrupted, his voice taking on a deeper resonance. "In Vietnam, I learned that a minute could be the difference between life and death. In the operating room, I applied that same understanding. But I also learned something else, something that took me far too long to understand." He gestured to the gathering below, where the honor guard was performing their ceremonial duties with precise, measured movements. "Those men down there understand it. Joe Martinez understood it. Every minute we spend honoring sacrifice, showing respect, acknowledging our shared humanity. Those aren't minutes wasted. They're minutes invested in something greater than ourselves." Victoria felt her professional certainties beginning to waver, but she held firm to her convictions. "With all due respect, Colonel, sentiment doesn't save lives. Precision does. Efficiency does. Every minute we spend standing here is a minute that could be spent in surgery, actually making a difference." Colonel Harrison's response was interrupted by a commotion near the elevator. A young resident was rushing toward them, tablet in hand. "Dr. Reynolds, Mr. Thompson's pre-op labs. There's an irregularity we need to discuss." Victoria felt a surge of vindication. This was exactly why strict scheduling was essential. She reached for the tablet, but Colonel Harrison spoke first. "Type B aortic dissection?" he asked calmly. The resident nodded, surprised. "Complicated by recent anticoagulant therapy?" Another nod. The colonel smiled slightly. "The same condition I operated on successfully over 200 times during my tenure here. The procedure can wait 30 minutes without increasing risk. In fact, the additional time allows for better medication clearance." Victoria stared at him, her certainties shaken. The colonel wasn't just any veteran, he was a legendary thoracic surgeon, one whose techniques were still taught in medical school. She had used his innovations countless times without ever connecting them to the decorated military man standing before her. Sometimes, Dr. Reynolds, he continued, his voice gentler now, the most important thing we can do is stop. Stop rushing, stop measuring, stop trying to control every minute. Look down there. He gestured to where an elderly veteran in a wheelchair was being helped into position by two young nurses. That man survived the chosen reservoir in Korea. He's here today because Joe Martinez sat with him every week during his chemotherapy, telling him stories about their shared experiences, giving him a reason to keep fighting. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows through the corridor. Victoria watched as the honor guard below continued their ceremony, their movements precise yet somehow more meaningful than mere efficiency. She found herself studying Colonel Harrison's face, seeing for the first time the subtle interplay of strength and compassion, of military discipline and human understanding. "You see, Doctor," he said, reading her expression, "there's a difference between being precise and being right, between being efficient and being effective, between saving a life and honoring what makes life worth saving." He straightened his uniform jacket with an unconscious gesture, his medals catching the light. "I learned that lesson in rice paddies and field hospitals, in operating rooms and veterans' homes. The question is, are you willing to learn it here today?" The weight of his words hung in the air between them, challenging everything Victoria had built her career upon. Her watch showed 7:54 a.m., but for the first time in years, the numbers seemed to carry less significance than the moment they measured. Victoria felt the professional certainties of her career beginning to crack under Colonel Harrison's steady gaze. The medical credentials she had just discovered he possessed made it impossible to dismiss his perspective as mere military sentimentality. He understood both worlds, the precise requirements of surgery and the deeper meanings of service, in ways that challenged her carefully constructed worldview. "Your reputation precedes you, Dr. Reynolds," Colonel Harrison continued, his voice carrying the measured tone of a skilled surgeon delivering difficult news. "Lowest mortality rate in the department, highest efficiency ratings, most surgeries performed per quarter, impressive metrics by any standard." He paused, allowing the praise to settle before delivering his next words with careful precision. "But I've reviewed your patient satisfaction scores as well." Victoria felt her spine stiffen. Patient satisfaction was a metric she had always considered secondary to surgical outcomes. "My patients live, Colonel. I would think survival would be satisfaction enough." "Survival without dignity is something soldiers understand all too well," he responded, gesturing to the gathering below. "Look at them, Doctor. Many of these veterans survived experiences that would break most people, but it wasn't just medical intervention that saved them. It was respect for themselves, for each other, for the sacrifices they've shared." The ceremony outside had reached a crucial moment. The honor guard was presenting the folded flag to Joe Martinez's family. Victoria watched as his widow received it with trembling hands, her face showing both grief and pride. The sight stirred something uncomfortable in Victoria's chest, a sensation she usually suppressed with surgical precision. "I have 3 surgeries scheduled today," she said, attempting to redirect the conversation to familiar territory. 3 families waiting for my skills, my efficiency, my focus. How do I justify delaying their care for a ceremony?" Colonel Harrison's response was interrupted by a commotion near the end of the corridor. An elderly veteran had collapsed, his wheelchair tipping dangerously. Without thinking, Victoria moved toward him, her medical training taking over. But before she could reach him, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. 4 members of the honor guard had broken formation, moving with disciplined urgency to assist. Their response was as coordinated as any surgical team, each person knowing their role without discussion. They stabilized the wheelchair, checked the veteran's vital signs, and provided comfort with an efficiency that matched any hospital protocol. "You see, Doctor," Colonel Harrison said softly, appearing beside her, "discipline and compassion aren't mutually exclusive. Neither are efficiency and respect." He nodded toward the honor guard members, who were now ensuring the elderly veteran was comfortable while maintaining their military bearing. These men understand that every action can be both precise and meaningful. Victoria watched as the elderly veteran regained his composure, clearly embarrassed by his moment of weakness. But the honor guard's response had preserved both his safety and his dignity. It was a form of care she had never fully considered, one that went beyond mere medical intervention. "Your surgical skills are impressive, Dr. Reynolds," Colonel Harrison continued, "but surgery is more than just a technical procedure. It's a sacred trust. Every patient on your table is someone's Joe Martinez, someone's brother, father, uncle, friend. They're not just cases to be processed efficiently." The words struck Victoria with unexpected force. She thought of her recent morbidity and mortality report presentation, where she had referred to patients by their procedure types rather than their names. It had seemed more efficient at the time, more professional. Now, watching the interaction below, she began to see it differently. "When I was chief of surgery," Colonel Harrison said, noting her thoughtful expression, "I instituted a policy that every surgical team had to learn one personal detail about each patient before entering the operating room. Not their medical history, something about their life, their family, their dreams. It added exactly 2 minutes to our pre-op procedure. Would you like to know what happened to our outcomes?" Victoria found herself nodding, despite her ingrained skepticism. Complication rates dropped by 12%. Post-operative recovery times improved by an average of 2 days. Staff satisfaction scores increased significantly. He smiled slightly at her surprised expression. "It turns out that seeing patients as people makes us better doctors, not less efficient ones." The morning sun had risen higher now, casting different shadows through the corridor. Victoria's watch showed 8:02 a.m., her carefully planned schedule now completely disrupted. But for the first time in her career, the numbers on her watch seemed to carry less weight than the scene unfolding before her. "I don't expect you to change your entire approach to medicine in one morning, Doctor," Colonel Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But I do ask you to consider that perhaps there's room in your precise world for something more. Something that can't be measured in minutes or mortality rates." Victoria looked down at the ceremony again, seeing it with new eyes. The precise movements of the honor guard now appeared to her not just as ceremony, but as a form of care, one that honored both the living and the dead. It was efficiency in service of something greater than mere speed or throughput. The Colonel's words hung in the air between them, challenging everything she had built her career upon. And for the first time, Dr. Victoria Reynolds began to wonder if perhaps she had been measuring success by the wrong metrics all along. The silence that followed Colonel Harrison's words was interrupted by the approach of a young nurse Victoria hadn't seen before. She carried herself with unusual poise, and as she drew closer, Victoria noticed the small pin on her uniform indicating military service. The nurse stopped beside Colonel Harrison, offering a crisp but subtle salute before addressing them both. "Sir, Dr. Reynolds," she said, her voice steady but touched with emotion. "Mrs. Martinez asked if you would both join them below. She has something she'd like to share." The nurse's eyes met Victoria's with unexpected intensity. "It's about the last patient Joe helped before his own final battle." Victoria glanced at her watch automatically, 8:07 a.m., but the gesture felt hollow now, a reflex stripped of its former certainty. Colonel Harrison noticed the movement and smiled slightly. "Time moves differently when we measure it in moments that matter, Doctor. Shall we?" They followed the nurse toward the elevator, Victoria's usual rapid stride unconsciously slowing to match the colonel's measured pace. As they descended, he spoke quietly. His words meant only for her. "Before you meet Mrs. Martinez, there's something you should know about Joe's last days here at the hospital." The elevator doors opened to the main lobby, now transformed by the gathering of veterans and hospital staff. Victoria had passed through this space thousands of times, always focused on her destination, never really seeing it. Now, she found herself noticing details she'd overlooked. The wall of honor displaying photographs of staff members who had served, the small garden visible through the windows where Joe Martinez had often read to patients, the subtle ways the hospital acknowledged its connection to service. 2 weeks before his own death, Colonel Harrison continued as they walked, Joe spent 6 hours with a young patient in the oncology ward. The boy was refusing treatment, had given up hope. His parents were desperate. The medical team had tried everything. Explanations, encouragement, even mild threats about the consequences of refusing care. They approached the gathered crowd, which parted respectfully before them. Victoria saw Mrs. Martinez seated near the memorial display, a small photo album open in her lap. The woman's face showed grief, tempered by pride, sorrow, balanced with purpose. Joe came in that morning, as he had every Tuesday for years, Colonel Harrison said, his voice taking on a deeper resonance. He was in pain himself, the cancer was winning his own battle, but when he heard about the boy, he didn't hesitate. He sat with him, not as a volunteer reading stories, but as a Marine who understood what it meant to fight when victory seemed impossible. Mrs. Martinez looked up as they approached, her eyes finding Victoria's with unexpected warmth. She held up a photograph, and Victoria found herself looking at an image of Joe Martinez in his hospital volunteer jacket, sitting beside a young boy's bed. Both were smiling, the boy's head bald from chemotherapy, Joe's own frame gaunt from his disease, but their expressions showed a shared understanding that transcended their circumstances. "That boy was Danny Collins," Mrs. Martinez said, her voice steady despite her tears. 13 years old, stage 4 lymphoma, and determined to stop fighting. She touched the photograph gently. Joe spent that entire day telling him stories, not just about battles and bravery, but about the friends he'd lost, the times he'd wanted to give up, the reasons he kept going. He told Danny that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is live to fight another day. Victoria found herself drawn closer, the efficiency-driven part of her mind noting the medical equipment in the photograph's background, while something deeper recognized the profound connection captured in that moment. "Danny started his treatment again the next day," Colonel Harrison said quietly. "He's in remission now, starting high school next fall. But here's what you need to know, Dr. Reynolds. Joe never told Danny he was fighting cancer himself. Never mentioned that every minute he spent in that room was a minute of pain for him. Because that's not what soldiers do. They complete the mission, whatever the personal cost." Mrs. Martinez opened the album wider, revealing more photographs, Joe with various patients over the years, each image capturing a moment of connection, of shared courage, of human dignity preserved in the face of suffering. Victoria recognized some of the faces. Patients she had treated, cases she had considered processed successfully. The day after he sat with Danny, Mrs. Martinez continued, Joe's own condition worsened. He never made it back to the hospital as a volunteer, but he made sure Danny got letters sent from his own hospital bed until the very end. Each one signed the same way. "Keep fighting, soldier. Tomorrow needs you." Victoria felt something shift inside her, a fundamental realignment of how she measured value and success. She thought of her own patients, the ones she had treated with technical perfection but clinical detachment. How many Dannys had she encountered without seeing them? How many opportunities for deeper healing had she missed in her rush to maintain schedule efficiency? The morning sun now filled the lobby completely, illuminating the gathered faces. Veterans who had served alongside Joe, patients he had helped, staff members who had witnessed his quiet impact. Each person represented a story, a battle fought, a victory achieved not just through medical intervention, but through human connection. Colonel Harrison's voice drew her back to the present moment. "You see, Dr. Reynolds, this is why we take time for ceremonies like this. Not just to honor the dead, but to remind the living what it means to serve something greater than ourselves. Whether we carry a rifle or a scalpel, wear combat boots or surgical shoes, our true measure isn't in the battles we win, but in the lives we touch along the way." Victoria looked at her watch one last time, 8:15 a.m. The Thompson procedure would need to be rescheduled, her entire day reorganized. But as she stood there, surrounded by the evidence of a different kind of healing, she realized that perhaps some surgeries could wait, and some moments needed to be measured in meanings rather than minutes. Victoria stood in the hospital lobby, the weight of Mrs. Martinez's photo album still resonating in her mind. The morning sun had fully claimed the space now, casting long shadows behind the gathered veterans and transforming the usual sterile hospital environment into something more sacred. She found herself studying the faces around her with new awareness, seeing not just patients and staff members, but individuals whose stories she had never bothered to learn. Dr. Chen approached hesitantly, tablet still in hand, clearly uncertain how to handle the disruption to their surgical schedule. Victoria could read the anxiety in his posture, the careful way he maintained a professional distance while waiting for her inevitable reaction to the delayed procedure. She had trained her residents well in the art of efficiency, perhaps too well. "Dr. Reynolds," he began, his voice careful and measured, "I've contacted Mr. Thompson's family about the delay. They're actually—" He paused, seeming surprised by his own next words. "They're grateful for the extra time. His daughter's flight was delayed, and now she'll be able to see him before surgery." The information struck Victoria with unexpected force. In all her careful scheduling, her precise timing, her efficient processing of surgical cases, how many family moments had she inadvertently disrupted? How many last conversations had been cut short in service of her rigid timetable? Colonel Harrison, who had been speaking quietly with another veteran, turned at Dr. Chen's words. "Timing, Dr. Reynolds," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet authority, "is about more than just clock management. Sometimes the most efficient path isn't the most effective one." Victoria felt herself caught between two worlds, the precise, controlled environment she had built her career upon, and this new perspective that suggested a different kind of precision, a different form of care. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts, each one challenging her long-held beliefs about medical excellence. She thought of her last morbidity and mortality conference, where she had presented her impressive efficiency metrics. The other surgeons had nodded in appreciation of her numbers, but now she remembered something else, the slight frown on the palliative care doctor's face, the quiet comment from the oncology nurse about patient comfort, the unasked questions that hung in the air after her presentation. "I've built my entire career on maximizing surgical efficiency," she said, more to herself than to those around her. "Every minute saved in the operating room is a minute that could be used to help another patient. How do I reconcile that with—" She gestured to the ceremony, the gathered veterans, the evidence of Joe Martinez's impact. "With this," and a veteran in a wheelchair moved closer, his Vietnam veteran cap adorned with medals that spoke of his own sacrifices. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" he asked, the military formality somehow fitting in this moment. At Victoria's nod, he continued, "In combat we had a saying, 'Slow is smooth and smooth is fast.' Sometimes taking the extra moment to do things right saves time in the long run. Victoria found herself drawn into conversation with the veteran, whose name was Thomas Rodriguez. He had been a combat medic, and his perspective on emergency care in the field offered a different view of medical efficiency. "We had protocols, sure," he explained, "but we also knew that every soldier we treated was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father. Taking that extra moment to offer comfort didn't just help them, it helped us maintain our own humanity in the midst of chaos." The words echoed with uncomfortable truth. Victoria thought of her own protocols, her precise schedules, her efficiently managed surgical department. She had achieved excellent outcomes, but at what cost to the human element of medical care? How many opportunities for deeper healing had she missed in her rush to maintain her metrics? Dr. Chen was still standing nearby, and Victoria noticed something she had missed before, a small photograph tucked into the clear cover of his tablet. It showed an older man in military dress blues, standing proud and straight. "Your father?" she asked, surprising herself with the personal question. The young resident nodded, his expression softening. "Yes, he served in Desert Storm. He's the reason I became a doctor. He always said that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about honoring the spirit that keeps fighting." Victoria felt the impact of these accumulated moments, these small revelations that challenged everything she had built her career upon. Her watch showed 8:30 a.m. now, and her efficiently planned day was thoroughly disrupted. Yet somehow, standing here among these veterans, these families, these colleagues she had never truly known, the disruption felt less like a failure and more like an opportunity. Colonel Harrison approached again, noting her thoughtful expression. "You know, Dr. Reynolds, in combat medicine we had a concept called the golden hour, that crucial period where rapid intervention could mean the difference between life and death. But we also learned that sometimes the most important intervention isn't the fastest one. Sometimes it's the one that honors both the body and the spirit of the soldier we're treating." Victoria looked around the lobby once more, seeing it with new eyes. The precision of the honor guard's movements now seemed less like a waste of time and more like a different form of medicine, one that healed wounds she couldn't see in her operating room. The gathered veterans, standing or sitting at attention despite their age or infirmity, demonstrated a kind of strength that couldn't be measured in her efficient metrics. Her pager buzzed at her hip, a familiar reminder of the waiting medical world above. But for the first time in her career, Dr. Victoria Reynolds felt no immediate urgency to respond. Instead, she found herself wondering what other lessons this morning might hold, what other truths she might discover if she allowed herself the time to learn them. The insistent buzzing of Victoria's pager grew more urgent, demanding her attention. Dr. Chen glanced at his own device and looked up with concern. "Dr. Reynolds, the surgical team is assembled in OR3. They're awaiting your decision about the Thompson procedure." Victoria felt the weight of professional expectations pressing against her newfound awareness. The efficient surgeon she had been just an hour ago would have already been scrubbing in, irritated by the delay, focused solely on maintaining her precise schedule. But that surgeon hadn't yet learned what she was learning here in this transformed hospital lobby. Colonel Harrison observed her internal struggle with knowing eyes. "Decisions made at the crossroads often define us, Doctor," he said quietly, "not just by their immediate outcomes, but by the precedent they set for future choices." Before Victoria could respond, the elevator doors opened and Dr. Margaret Chen, the hospital's chief of surgery, stepped out. Victoria felt her spine stiffen automatically. Dr. Chen had been a strong supporter of her efficiency-focused approach to department management, often citing her metrics as an example for others to follow. "Victoria," Dr. Chen said, approaching with purpose, "I've just come from the surgical floor. We have 3 procedures scheduled this morning, and the delay is creating a cascading effect on the day's schedule. The board members are particularly concerned about the impact on our efficiency metrics. The old Victoria would have immediately responded with a detailed plan for recovering lost time, for minimizing the impact on surgical throughput, for maintaining the department's prestigious performance rankings. Instead, she found herself looking past Dr. Chen to where Mrs. Martinez sat with her photo album, surrounded by veterans who understood something about service that couldn't be captured in performance metrics. "Dr. Chen," Victoria began, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, "do you know why Joe Martinez spent 6 hours with a 13-year-old cancer patient 2 weeks before his own death?" She didn't wait for a response. "He did it because sometimes healing requires more than just medical intervention. Sometimes it requires us to recognize that every patient is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend." Dr. Chen's expression showed surprise at this unexpected response from her usually efficiency-focused surgeon. "Victoria, no one is questioning the importance of patient care, but we have protocols, schedules, metrics to maintain." "Yes, we do," Colonel Harrison interjected, stepping forward. "And as the former chief of surgery at this hospital, I can tell you that those metrics mean nothing if they don't serve the fundamental purpose of medicine, to heal in every sense of the word." Victoria watched as recognition dawned on Dr. Chen's face. The colonel's reputation still carried weight in these halls, his legacy extending beyond his military service to his years of surgical innovation. But it was his next words that truly captured the moment's significance. "Margaret," he said, addressing Dr. Chen by her first name, "do you remember the day you first told me you wanted to become a surgeon? You were a third-year resident, and you'd just spent 4 hours with a dying patient's family, well beyond your shift. When I asked you why, you said something I've never forgotten. Sometimes the most important surgery we perform is on the human spirit." Dr. Chen's professional demeanor softened slightly, the memory clearly striking a chord. Victoria saw something pass between the 2 veteran surgeons, an understanding that transcended administrative concerns and efficiency metrics. The morning sun had risen higher now, its light filling the lobby with an almost ethereal quality. Through the windows, Victoria could see more people gathering. Hospital staff, patients, families, all drawn to the ceremony that honored not just one man's service, but a deeper truth about what it meant to care for others. Her pager buzzed again, but this time Victoria reached for it with new purpose. "Dr. Chen," she said, "I'd like to propose something. The Thompson procedure needs to be delayed, not just for the ceremony, but because his daughter deserves the chance to see her father before surgery. And while we're waiting, I think we should take this opportunity to remember why we became doctors in the first place." She gestured to the gathered veterans, to Mrs. Martinez with her photo album, to the honor guard standing at attention. "These men and women understand something about service that we've perhaps forgotten in our rush to measure success in minutes and metrics. They understand that true efficiency isn't just about speed. It's about making every moment count for something meaningful." Dr. Chen was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving from Victoria to Colonel Harrison to the ceremony beyond. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of recognition. "You know, Victoria, when I first supported your efficiency initiatives, it was because I saw in you the same drive for excellence that I once had. But perhaps we've both forgotten something important along the way." Victoria felt the weight of this moment, understanding that she stood at a crossroads in her career. The carefully constructed world of surgical efficiency she had built now seemed somehow smaller, less significant than the larger truths she was discovering. The sound of taps began playing again, the mournful notes floating through the lobby. Victoria watched as Dr. Chen unconsciously straightened her posture, responding to the ceremony's solemnity. Around them, the gathered crowd stood in respectful silence, each person connected by something more profound than hospital protocols or surgical schedules. "Sometimes," Colonel Harrison said softly, his words meant for both surgeons, "the most important operations we perform aren't found in any surgical manual. They're the moments when we choose to see beyond our protocols and recognize the humanity in our calling." Victoria looked at her watch one final time, but now she saw the numbers differently. They weren't just measurements of time to be managed, but opportunities to make each moment matter in ways that couldn't be captured in efficiency reports or surgical metrics. The decision to delay the Thompson procedure had created ripples throughout the hospital's surgical department, but Victoria found herself standing firmly in the calm center of the storm she had created. Dr. Chen had returned to the surgical floor to manage the schedule adjustments, leaving Victoria in the transformed lobby with Colonel Harrison and the continuing ceremony. "You've taken the first step," the colonel said, watching as the honor guard prepared for another phase of the ceremony. "But understanding why we're here today requires going deeper than just accepting a delayed surgery schedule." Victoria nodded, her mind already processing the implications of her choice. The efficient surgeon in her was calculating the impact on department metrics, while something newer, something deeper, was beginning to recognize other forms of measurement. Sarah Martinez approached them, carrying a weathered leather-bound journal. "Uncle Joe kept this during his last months," she explained, holding it out to Victoria. "He wrote about every patient he visited, every story he shared, every battle he helped them fight. I think you should read today's entry." Victoria accepted the journal with careful hands, noting the precise handwriting that filled its pages, the kind of attention to detail she recognized from her own surgical notes. She turned to the marked page and began to read. "Today's battle isn't against the enemy we can see. Young Danny Collins faces an opponent as ruthless as any I encountered in combat, but he has something many soldiers didn't: time to choose his response to fear. I told him about Hill 881, about watching good men fall and still pushing forward, not because we weren't afraid, but because something bigger than fear drove us. Danny needs to understand, courage isn't about not being scared. It's about finding reasons to fight that matter more than fear." The words resonated with unexpected force. Victoria thought about her own approach to patient care, efficient, precise, technically perfect, but perhaps missing something fundamental about the nature of healing. She had always viewed fear as an obstacle to be overcome through procedure and protocol, never as an opportunity for connection. Colonel Harrison's voice drew her from her thoughts. "Joe understood something essential about both military service and medical care," he said. "The battles we fight aren't just against physical enemies, disease, injury, death. They're also against despair, hopelessness, isolation. Sometimes the most important victory is helping someone find their will to fight." Victoria found herself drawing parallels to her own surgical experience. How many times had she dismissed preoperative anxiety as an inefficient emotional response? How many opportunities for meaningful connection had she sacrificed in the name of maintaining schedule efficiency? A young nurse approached, someone Victoria recognized from the oncology ward but had never really noticed before. "Dr. Reynolds," she said, "I was with Danny Collins during many of Mr. Martinez's visits. The medical charts showed his numbers improving after their talks, but they couldn't measure what really changed: his spirit, his determination, his sense of purpose." The nurse's words triggered a memory from Victoria's residency, long buried under years of efficiency metrics and performance standards. She had once spent an entire night with a preoperative patient, not because the medical situation required it, but because something in the patient's eyes had spoken to her of deeper needs. The next morning, her attending physician had commended not her medical knowledge, but her understanding of healing's human dimension. We call it presence in the military, Colonel Harrison explained, noting her thoughtful expression. The ability to be fully engaged in a moment, to recognize that sometimes the most important thing we can offer isn't our skill or efficiency, but our complete attention and understanding. Victoria looked around the lobby again, seeing it with evolving awareness. The honor guard's precisely timed movements now appeared to her as more than just ceremony. They were expressions of presence, of complete dedication to honoring each moment. The gathered veterans, standing or sitting at attention despite physical discomfort, demonstrated a form of healing that went beyond medical intervention. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Thompson's daughter, who had finally made it to the hospital. The young woman's face showed the strain of rushed travel and worry about her father's surgery, but also relief at not having missed this crucial moment. Victoria watched as she was quickly surrounded by caring nurses and staff members, each contributing to a form of medicine that wouldn't appear on any surgical schedule. "You know, Doctor," Colonel Harrison said softly, "in combat medicine, we learned that survival often depends on more than just quick treatment. Soldiers who felt connected to something larger than themselves, their unit, their mission, their families back home, often showed remarkable resilience." Joe Martinez understood this. Every story he shared, every moment he spent with patients, was about helping them find their larger purpose. Victoria found herself returning to the journal in her hands, turning pages filled with observations about courage, connection, and the deeper meaning of service. Joe Martinez had created something that her efficient systems could never capture, a legacy of healing that extended far beyond the physical realm. The morning sun had reached its full strength now, filling the lobby with clear light that seemed to illuminate more than just the physical space. Victoria realized that she was experiencing her own form of illumination, understanding at last that true medical excellence required more than just technical precision and efficient scheduling. The arrival of Mr. Thompson's daughter had created a momentary stir in the lobby, drawing attention away from the ongoing ceremony. Victoria watched as the young woman, still carrying her travel bag, embraced an elderly nurse she clearly recognized from previous hospital visits. The scene sparked something in Victoria's memory, another detail from Joe Martinez's journal that suddenly seemed significant. "Sarah," she called softly to the nurse who had shared her uncle's journal. "The entry about Danny Collins? Was there more? Something about family connections?" Sarah Martinez nodded and gently took the journal, turning to another marked page. "Uncle Joe wrote this the day after his last visit with Danny," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "He knew by then that he wouldn't be coming back to the hospital as a volunteer." Victoria began reading the new entry, aware that Colonel Harrison had moved closer to listen. "A soldier never truly fights alone. Every battle has two fronts, the one we can see and the one in our hearts. Today, I watched Danny's mother trying to be strong for her son, hiding her own fear behind encouraging smiles. It reminded me of my own mother during Vietnam, how her letters carried more strength than any weapon I ever carried. I told Danny that accepting support isn't weakness, it's another form of courage. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is let others help us fight." The words resonated with newfound meaning as Victoria looked up to see Mr. Thompson's daughter being escorted to a quiet consultation room. Dr. Chen had appeared again and was explaining the surgical delay with unexpected gentleness, taking time to ensure the daughter understood everything about her father's condition. "You're seeing it now, aren't you?" Colonel Harrison asked quietly. "The ripple effect of one delayed surgery, one allowed moment, one human connection." Before Victoria could respond, a commotion near the hospital entrance drew their attention. A group of young soldiers in formal dress uniforms had arrived, led by a tall, thin young man whose face bore the unmistakable marks of recent chemotherapy. Victoria felt her breath catch as she recognized him from the photograph in Joe's album. Danny Collins, now clearly in remission, standing straight and proud in his military uniform. He enlisted as soon as he was cleared by his oncologists, Sarah explained, watching Danny approach Mrs. Martinez. Said he wanted to serve like the man who taught him how to fight his toughest battle. Victoria watched as Danny knelt before Mrs. Martinez, presenting her with his first set of military insignia pins. The elderly woman's hands trembled as she accepted them, adding them to the memorial display beside her husband's photographs. The moment carried a weight that no efficiency metric could ever capture. "You know, Dr. Reynolds," Colonel Harrison said, his voice carrying decades of understanding, "in medicine, we often talk about the multiplier effect, how one intervention can lead to multiple positive outcomes. But there's another kind of multiplier effect in healthcare, one that Joe Martinez understood intuitively. Every moment of genuine connection, every instance of true presence, multiplies hope and healing in ways we can't measure but can profoundly feel." Victoria found herself thinking of her own patient interactions over the years. How many Danny Collins had she encountered without recognizing their need for more than just technical excellence? How many opportunities for deeper healing had she missed in her relentless pursuit of efficiency? The ceremony was reaching another significant moment. The honor guard had begun the formal presentation of service medals earned by Joe Martinez during his military career. Each medal was presented with precise movements and solemn words, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the deeper patterns of life and service. "Distinguished Service Cross," the honor guard commander announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed lobby, "awarded for exceptional gallantry in service." The citation continued, describing an action in Vietnam where Joe had risked his life to save wounded comrades under heavy fire. Victoria listened as medal after medal was presented, each one telling part of a larger story of service. But it was the final presentation that struck her most deeply, a simple volunteer service pin from the hospital, represented with the same ceremony and respect as the highest military honors. "This is what we mean by presence, by service, by healing," Colonel Harrison said softly. "Joe Martinez earned his military medals in moments of extraordinary courage, but he lived their meaning every day in these halls. Every child he comforted, every family he supported, every battle he helped others fight, these were extensions of the same commitment to service that earned him those combat decorations." The morning had grown late, the sun now high above the hospital. Victoria's efficiently planned surgery schedule lay in well-organized ruins, yet she felt no anxiety about the disruption. Instead, she found herself experiencing a profound shift in understanding about the true nature of medical service. Danny Collins had moved to stand at attention with the honor guard, his presence bridging the gap between military service and medical healing. In him, Victoria could see the living result of Joe Martinez's understanding that some battles required more than just technical intervention. They required human connection, shared courage, and the recognition that true healing often happened in the moments between scheduled procedures. Her pager remained silent now, as if the hospital itself was acknowledging the importance of this unscheduled time. In its silence, Victoria heard something new, the steady rhythm of genuine service, the quiet music of human connection, the profound truth that efficiency without empathy was an empty achievement. The ceremony had reached a natural pause, and Victoria found herself walking with Colonel Harrison toward the surgical floor. Her mind was already beginning to process how to integrate her new understanding into the practical demands of running a surgical department. The elevator ride gave her a moment to reflect on the morning's transformative events. "You're thinking about implementation," Colonel Harrison observed, reading her expression with the insight of someone who had navigated similar waters, wondering how to balance efficiency with empathy, protocol with presence. Victoria nodded, appreciating his perception. The department still needs to function. Surgeries need to be performed, schedules maintained, outcomes achieved. But now I see there's something more, something essential that I've been missing. As they stepped out onto the surgical floor, they encountered a scene that perfectly illustrated her challenge. The Thompson family had gathered in the waiting area. Father, mother, daughter just arrived from her delayed flight and 2 sons. Under her old approach, Victoria would have seen them as an impediment to efficient preoperative procedures. Now, she saw something different. "Dr. Reynolds," Mr. Thompson called out, his voice carrying a mix of anxiety and hope. "They told us the surgery was delayed because of a military ceremony. My father—" He paused, touching the veteran's pin on his lapel. "He served in Korea. He would understand." Victoria moved toward the family, aware that her next actions would set the tone for her new approach to patient care. She glanced at her watch, not to check the schedule, but to ensure she could give them the time they deserved. "Mr. Thompson," she began, pulling up a chair to sit at their level, "tell me about your father's service. Help me understand the man I'm about to operate on." The words felt foreign, yet right on her tongue, like a new language she was meant to speak. The family's surprise at her request was evident, but Mr. Thompson's daughter leaned forward eagerly. "Dad was a combat medic," she explained. "He never talked much about it until I started nursing school. Then he told me that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about remembering that every patient has a story that matters." Colonel Harrison, who had been observing quietly, stepped forward. "A combat medic," he said, his voice carrying respectful recognition. Then he understood, as we all learned to understand, that medicine is about more than procedures. It's about presence. Victoria watched as Mr. Thompson's family responded to this acknowledgement of their father's service. The tension in their postures eased slightly, replaced by a sense of being truly seen and understood. She realized that this conversation, which her old self would have considered an inefficient use of pre-operative time, was actually an essential part of the healing process. Dr. Chen appeared at the nurses' station, clearly surprised to find her most efficient surgeon engaged in what appeared to be a casual conversation with a patient's family. But as she watched, something in her expression shifted, recognition perhaps, of what she'd witnessed earlier in the lobby. "The OR team is ready whenever you are, Dr. Reynolds," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "But take the time you need. Some preparations can't be rushed." Victoria nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in the Chief of Surgery's words. She turned back to the Thompson family, noting details she would have missed before. The way the daughter held her father's hand, the brother's protective stance, the mother's quiet strength. "Mr. Thompson's surgery is complex but straightforward," she explained, using language that balanced professional confidence with human connection. "But before we begin, I want to understand what victory looks like for your family. Not just in medical terms, but in the things that matter to you." The family exchanged glances, clearly unused to this approach from a surgeon. Mr. Thompson's wife spoke up, her voice steady despite her evident emotion. "He has a granddaughter graduating next month. He wants to be there, to see her walk across the stage. That's his immediate mission, as he calls it." Victoria felt something shift in her understanding of surgical timing. The procedure's technical aspects remained crucial, but now she saw them as part of a larger picture, one that included graduation ceremonies and family celebrations, hopes and dreams that extended beyond recovery room protocols. She stood, aware that the operating room staff was waiting, but now seeing the preparation time differently. "Colonel," she said, turning to Harrison, "in combat medicine, how did you prepare your team for difficult operations?" His response carried years of hard-earned wisdom. "We made sure everyone understood, not just what we were doing, but why we were doing it. Every procedure had a face, a story, a reason that mattered beyond the medical charts. Victoria nodded, then turned to Dr. Chen. "I'd like to institute a new pre-operative protocol," she said. "Before each major surgery, we take 5 minutes, just 5, to share something about the patient's story with the entire surgical team. Not their medical history. We have that in the charts, their human history, the things that make this operation matter beyond our surgical metrics." Dr. Chen studied her for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Like Joe Martinez's 2 minutes with each patient," she said. "Sometimes small changes in procedure can lead to large changes in outcome." As Victoria prepared to scrub in for the Thompson procedure, she felt a new kind of efficiency taking shape in her mind, one that measured success not just in minutes saved, but in moments that mattered. The operating room would still run with precision, but now it would be precision with purpose, efficiency with understanding, technical excellence in service of human needs. The Thompson procedure had concluded successfully, taking exactly 12 minutes longer than Victoria's usual time for this type of surgery. But as she made her final notations in the surgical record, she realized she measured the success differently now. The extra minutes had been invested in ensuring her team understood not just the procedure, but the person they were helping to heal. As Victoria emerged from the operating room, she found Colonel Harrison waiting in the surgical wing's conference room, reviewing what appeared to be old medical records. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the papers spread before him. "I thought you might be interested in these," he said, gesturing to the documents. "They're the efficiency reports from my time as Chief of Surgery, including the period when we implemented what the board called our humanitarian protocols." Victoria approached. Her surgical precision now turned to examining these historical records. The data told a compelling story. Patient satisfaction had increased dramatically, staff retention had improved, and most surprisingly, long-term recovery rates had shown statistically significant improvement. "But the most interesting data isn't in these reports," Colonel Harrison continued, pulling out a weathered leather notebook similar to Joe Martinez's journal. "This is where I kept track of what really mattered." He opened the notebook, revealing page after page of handwritten notes. Each entry contained not just medical outcomes, but personal details about patients, their families, their struggles and triumphs. Victoria recognized the same kind of attention to human detail that she had seen in Joe Martinez's writings. A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Chen entered, followed by several members of the hospital board. Victoria straightened, expecting questions about the day's scheduling disruptions. Instead, Dr. Chen was smiling. "The Thompson family asked me to share something with you," she said, her voice carrying an unusual warmth. "When you took the time to listen to their father's story, to acknowledge his service as a combat medic, they said it was the first time they felt truly seen in a hospital setting. Mr. Thompson's blood pressure actually stabilized during pre-op, something we've been struggling with for days." One of the board members, an elderly gentleman Victoria had often seen but never really noticed, stepped forward. She now saw the veteran's pin on his lapel, identical to the one Mr. Thompson had worn. "Dr. Reynolds," he said, "we've been watching your department's efficiency metrics with great interest over the years. They're impressive, certainly, but today we saw something more valuable. We saw healing that extends beyond the operating room." Victoria felt the weight of the morning's lessons settling into place. She thought of the ceremony still concluding in the lobby, of Danny Collins standing proud in his uniform, of Joe Martinez's legacy living on through the lives he had touched. Her response came from a place of new understanding. "Efficiency without empathy is like precision without purpose," she said, surprising herself with the clarity of the insight. I've been measuring success by the wrong metrics. Joe Martinez showed us that every moment we invest in human connection pays dividends in healing that can't be captured in our traditional data points. Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly, but it was Dr. Chen who spoke next. The board has been discussing a proposal, she said, to establish a new protocol for patient care, one that balances our need for efficient operations with our commitment to humanitarian medicine. We'd like you to help develop it, Victoria. Your perspective, both before and after today, could be invaluable. Victoria looked down at her watch, a gesture that had once been about controlling time, but now felt like acknowledging its value. The afternoon light filled the conference room, reminding her of how much had changed since the morning's ceremony began. I'd be honored, she said, but I think we need to include others in this development. The nurses who understand our patients' daily struggles, the veterans who can teach us about service and sacrifice, the families who see healthcare from the other side of our efficiency metrics. She turned to Colonel Harrison. And we need to remember what Joe Martinez taught us, that sometimes the most efficient path to healing isn't the shortest one. The colonel smiled, gathering his records and rising to his feet. There's one more part of the ceremony you should see, he said, something that might help shape your new protocols. They made their way back to the lobby, where the afternoon sun had transformed the space into something almost sacred. The honor guard had been joined by hospital staff members, creating an impromptu corridor of respect. Through this corridor walked current and former patients, each carrying a small token to add to the memorial display. Victoria watched as Danny Collins, still in his dress uniform, helped a young cancer patient place a hand-drawn picture next to Joe Martinez's photograph. The child's bald head and IV pole marked him as a current warrior in his own battle, but his smile as Danny spoke to him showed the kind of healing that no efficiency metric could measure. You see, Colonel Harrison said softly, every person who passes through those hospital doors is fighting their own battle. Our job isn't just to treat their illness, it's to honor their fight. Joe understood that. Now I think you do too. As the afternoon progressed, Victoria found herself drawn into conversations that would have once seemed like inefficient uses of her time. The surgical floor had developed an unusual atmosphere, with staff members moving between their duties with a new awareness of purpose. Word had spread about her interaction with the Thompson family, and she noticed subtle changes in how her colleagues approached their work. Dr. Chen appeared at her side as Victoria finished reviewing post-operative notes. The board members are quite impressed with the changes they've observed today, she said, her tone carrying professional approval tinged with personal warmth. But more importantly, the staff is responding in ways we hadn't anticipated. Victoria looked up to see one of her surgical residents, Dr. Williams, speaking with a patient's family in the consultation room. Through the glass, she could see him sitting at their level, maintaining eye contact, fully present in a way that reminded her of Joe Martinez's approach to patient care. He was watching you earlier, Dr. Chen explained, following her gaze. When you took time with the Thompson family, sometimes the most powerful teaching doesn't happen in the operating room. Colonel Harrison joined them, carrying fresh copies of what appeared to be departmental protocols. I've been reviewing your surgical department's current efficiency metrics, he said, placing the documents on the desk. Impressive numbers, certainly, but I wonder if we might develop new metrics that capture what we've witnessed today. Victoria considered this challenge, her mind naturally organizing the possibilities. We could track long-term recovery rates, not just immediate surgical outcomes, monitor patient engagement levels, family participation in recovery planning, measure the impact of pre-operative relationship building on post-operative recovery. Now you're thinking like a healer, not just a surgeon, Colonel Harrison approved, but there's something else I'd like you to see. He led them to the hospital's main conference room, where the afternoon light streamed through large windows. Inside, they found an unexpected gathering. Members of the honor guard stood at ease, speaking quietly with hospital staff. Danny Collins was there, still in his dress uniform, engaged in conversation with several oncology nurses. But it was the presence of Mrs. Martinez and her photo album that drew Victoria's attention. "We've been sharing stories," Mrs. Martinez said, gesturing to the album. "About Joe, about the patients he helped, about the way he brought military values into medical care. Dr. Chen suggested we might help develop the new protocols you're working on." Victoria felt the weight of this moment, understanding that she was witnessing the intersection of military service and medical care in its purest form. The honor guard members, standing straight and dignified, even at ease, embodied the discipline she had always valued. But now she saw how that discipline could serve a deeper purpose. "Tell me about the protocols Joe followed," she said, sitting down beside Mrs. Martinez. "Not the official ones, his personal approach to patient care." Mrs. Martinez opened the album to a page filled with handwritten notes. "He called it his mission parameters," she explained. "First, always acknowledge the person before the patient. Second, recognize that every medical battle has a human story behind it. Third, understand that healing happens in the moments between procedures." The assembled group listened intently as Mrs. Martinez continued through Joe's list. Victoria found herself taking mental notes, seeing how each principle could be integrated into formal medical protocols without losing its essential humanity. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. "These principles align perfectly with our newest research on patient outcomes," she said. "Studies show that patient engagement and emotional well-being significantly impact recovery rates. We've been trying to quantify this effect, but perhaps we've been measuring the wrong things." A young nurse raised her hand tentatively. "In oncology, we've noticed that patients who feel truly seen and heard often show better responses to treatment." Mr. Martinez understood this instinctively. He could spend just 5 minutes with a patient and leave them feeling stronger, more determined to fight. Victoria thought about her own precisely timed patient interactions, how she had once considered anything beyond medical discussion to be inefficient. Now she understood that efficiency had different meanings in different contexts. "Colonel," she said, turning to Harrison, "in combat medicine, how did you balance the need for quick action with the human element of care?" His response was measured, drawing on decades of experience. "We learned that taking an extra moment to connect with a wounded soldier often made the entire treatment process more effective. They fought harder, healed faster, maintained hope longer. It wasn't time wasted. It was time invested." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the conference room windows, creating patterns that reminded Victoria of the morning ceremony. She watched as Danny Collins shared his story with a group of medical students who had gathered to listen. His journey from cancer patient to soldier embodied everything they were discussing: the power of human connection in medical care. Dr. Chen touched her arm gently. "The board has made a decision," she said quietly. "They want to establish a new position, Director of Humanitarian Medicine, someone to ensure that we maintain our efficiency without losing our humanity. They'd like you to consider taking it on, in addition to your surgical duties." Victoria felt the significance of this offer. Just this morning, she would have dismissed such a role as unnecessary, even counterproductive. Now she understood it as essential to the future of medical care. The following week brought significant changes to the surgical department at Mercy General. Victoria arrived at her usual early hour, but her morning rounds now carried a different rhythm. She still moved with purpose through the hospital corridors, but her stride had changed, measured rather than rushed, deliberate rather than hurried. The morning sun painted familiar patterns across the polished floors as Victoria approached the surgical wing. She passed the wall where Joe Martinez's photograph had been permanently installed, alongside a plaque describing his service both to his country and to the hospital. The honor guard ceremony had concluded days ago, but its impact continued to resonate through the hospital's daily operations. Dr. Williams, her resident, was already reviewing charts at the nurses' station. "Good morning, Dr. Reynolds," he said, holding out a tablet. "Mr. Peterson's pre-operative assessment is complete. His daughter mentioned he's anxious about missing his granddaughter's piano recital next week." Victoria noted how naturally the personal detail was included alongside the medical information. A week ago, such an observation would have seemed irrelevant to her. Now, it formed an essential part of her surgical planning. "Schedule the procedure for early morning," she instructed. "If we begin at 7, he should be recovered enough to attend the recital, even if just for a short time. The healing benefits of being present for his granddaughter will outweigh any minor inconvenience to our schedule." The nurses' station had undergone its own transformation. A small bulletin board now displayed photographs of recovered patients alongside their medical success stories. Victoria noticed that the staff had begun adding quotes from patients about their care experiences, creating a visible reminder of the human impact of their work. Colonel Harrison's influence remained present in the department's new protocols. Each morning began with what the staff had begun calling the mission brief, a short meeting where the day's surgical cases were discussed not just as procedures, but as people. Victoria led these sessions with a combination of military precision and medical compassion that would have seemed impossible to her just days ago. "Today's first procedure," she announced to the gathered surgical team, "is Robert Peterson, retired high school music teacher. He taught for 30 years, inspired countless students, and now his granddaughter is following in his musical footsteps. Our mission isn't just to repair his heart valve, it's to help him keep making music in his family's life." The surgical staff responded to this new approach with increasing enthusiasm. Victoria observed how the operating room dynamics had shifted. The same precise movements and technical excellence remained, but now they were infused with a deeper sense of purpose. Efficiency had become a tool for serving humanity rather than an end in itself. Dr. Chen joined Victoria as she completed her morning rounds. "The board is impressed with the initial results of our new protocols," she said, sharing a data tablet. "Post-operative recovery times are showing marked improvement. Patient satisfaction scores have increased significantly. Even our staff retention metrics are trending upward." Victoria reviewed the numbers with her characteristic thoroughness, but now she looked beyond the raw data. "Have you noticed how the residents are interacting with patients differently?" she asked. "They're learning to balance technical precision with emotional intelligence. It's changing the entire culture of our department." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Danny Collins, now a regular volunteer in the oncology ward. He wore his military bearing naturally, even in civilian clothes, and Victoria noticed how patients responded to his presence, the same way they had once responded to Joe Martinez. "The young patient in room 412 is having a difficult morning," Danny reported. "He's questioning whether to continue his treatment. Would you have time to speak with him, Dr. Reynolds? Your perspective as both a surgeon and someone who understands military discipline might help." Victoria checked her schedule, still precisely maintained, but now more flexibly interpreted. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said. "Some battles require reinforcements." The phrase would have seemed unnecessarily metaphorical to her former self, but now she understood its deeper truth. Medicine, like military service, was about fighting for something larger than oneself. Later that afternoon, Victoria found herself in a management meeting, presenting the preliminary results of their new humanitarian protocols. The efficiency experts in the room initially seemed skeptical, their laptops open to spreadsheets and productivity metrics. "Our surgical department has maintained its technical excellence," Victoria explained, standing before the projected data. "Our procedure times remain among the best in the region, but we're now measuring success in broader terms. Patient engagement has increased 40%. Family participation in recovery planning has doubled. Long-term recovery rates show statistically significant improvement." She shared slides that integrated traditional medical metrics with new measurements of patient well-being. The graphs told a story of a department that had found a way to serve both the science and the humanity of medicine. "Last week I would have presented these results differently," Victoria admitted. "I would have focused solely on throughput, on time saved, on numerical efficiency. But Joe Martinez and Colonel Harrison taught me that true medical excellence requires measuring what matters, not just what we can easily quantify." The afternoon light filtered through the conference room windows, reminiscent of that transformative morning a week ago. Victoria realized that while her external actions might appear similar to an outside observer, she still performed surgeries with precision, still maintained careful schedules, still expected excellence from her staff. The underlying purpose had fundamentally shifted. 1 month after the ceremony honoring Joe Martinez, Victoria stood at the podium in Mercy General's main conference center. The room was filled with medical professionals from across the country, gathered for a symposium on integrating humanitarian principles into modern medical practice. Through the windows, the morning sun cast the same golden light that had illuminated her transformation weeks before. "Efficiency in medicine isn't just about managing time," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned this lesson firsthand. "It's about investing time wisely in the moments that matter most. A month ago, I wouldn't have been standing here. I would have considered this conference an inefficient use of surgical hours. But a decorated veteran and a humble hospital volunteer taught me that some lessons can only be learned when we're willing to stop and truly listen." The audience included familiar faces. Dr. Chen sat in the front row, nodding approvingly. Colonel Harrison, now a regular consultant for the hospital's new humanitarian medicine program, watched from his seat near the platform. Danny Collins, dressed in his military uniform, had taken time from his duties to attend, representing the bridge between military service and medical care that had become central to their new approach. Victoria advanced to her next slide, showing the results of their first month under the new protocols. "Our surgical department's technical excellence remains unchanged," she explained. "Our procedures are still precise, our outcomes still exceptional. But we've added new metrics that capture the full spectrum of healing." The data told a compelling story. Patient recovery rates had improved by 23%. Staff burnout had decreased significantly. Family satisfaction scores had reached unprecedented levels. But it was the individual cases that truly illustrated the transformation. "Last week, we had a challenging thoracic procedure," Victoria continued. "Under our old protocols, we would have focused solely on the surgical plan. Instead, we took time to learn that our patient, a retired music teacher, had a granddaughter's recital he was determined to attend. Understanding this didn't just help us schedule the surgery more appropriately. It gave him an additional reason to engage fully in his recovery. He was able to attend that recital, and the joy it brought him contributed measurably to his healing process." She gestured to where Mr. Peterson sat in the audience, now recovered enough to attend the conference. His granddaughter's piano recital program was proudly displayed in the collection of patient stories that had become part of the hospital's ongoing tribute to Joe Martinez's legacy. "We've learned to measure success differently," Victoria explained. Yes, we track our surgical times, our efficiency metrics, our technical outcomes. But we also measure moments of connection, instances of understanding, opportunities for deeper healing. These aren't soft metrics. They translate directly into improved recovery rates, reduced complications, and better overall patient outcomes. Colonel Harrison had helped them develop what they now called the Martinez Protocol, a systematic approach to integrating military principles of service and respect into medical care. Each morning, surgical teams began their day with a mission briefing that included not just medical details, but personal context about each patient. The extra time invested paid dividends in improved team coordination and patient engagement. Our residents now learn more than just surgical techniques, Victoria continued. They learn how to be present with patients, how to balance efficiency with empathy, how to serve with both skill and compassion. We're training not just surgeons, but healers. The presentation screen showed images from the past month. Surgical teams engaged in their morning briefings, patients and families participating in recovery planning, staff members taking time to honor veterans in their care. Each photograph captured a moment that Victoria's former self would have considered inefficient, but that she now recognized as essential to true medical excellence. Joe Martinez spent his final months teaching us what he had learned in a lifetime of service, Victoria said, her voice carrying emotion she no longer tried to suppress. He showed us that every patient is fighting their own battle, that every family member is part of that fight, and that true medical care requires understanding the human story behind each procedure. She advanced to her final slide, showing the plaque that now hung in the hospital's main entrance. It bore Joe Martinez's photograph and his own words, recovered from his journal. The greatest honor in service, whether military or medical, is not in the battles we win, but in the lives we touch along the way. 1 month ago, I stood in our hospital lobby and watched an honor guard pay tribute to a man I had barely noticed during his years of volunteer service, Victoria concluded. I thought I was losing valuable surgical time. Instead, I was gaining an invaluable lesson in what it truly means to heal. Today, our hospital operates with the same precision, the same technical excellence, but with a deeper understanding of our true mission. We're not just treating conditions, we're honoring the human spirit that faces them. The applause that followed carried the weight of recognition from medical professionals who had perhaps seen themselves in Victoria's story. As she stepped down from the podium, she caught sight of her reflection in the conference room windows. She stood as straight as ever, carried herself with the same professional confidence, but now there was something more, a depth of understanding that had transformed her from an efficient surgeon into a true healer. Colonel Harrison met her at the edge of the stage. "You know," he said quietly, "in the military we say that a true leader's legacy isn't measured in battles won, but in lives changed. Joe Martinez would be proud of the change you've helped create here." Victoria touched the watch she still wore, the one that had once ruled her life with surgical precision. It now served a different purpose, not just measuring time, but reminding her to invest it wisely in the moments that mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.